October 1987. NBC Studios, Burbank. The stage was already warm, arc lights humming above the set, the band's brass still ringing faintly in the rafters. The applause sign had just gone dark, and for a moment you could hear what television usually hid: a soft settling of bodies in their seats, a few late coughs, the quiet friction of headphones in the control room. Behind Johnny Carson's desk, the familiar geometry of late night held steady. Microphones angled, water glass set, monologue cards squared into order. The red tally light on the main camera stayed on. America was listening. Then, in a motion that didn't belong to the routine, a figure stepped into the frame from the side, close enough to be seen, close enough to change the temperature in the room. It wasn't a guest. It wasn't a stagehand. It was Fred de Cordova, the executive producer, a man whose job was to keep the machine invisible precisely by never entering the picture. He handed Carson a folded note. Carson looked down, and for what felt like longer than television could tolerate, he said nothing. The silence lasted 11 seconds. In a medium built to fear dead air, 11 seconds is not a pause. It is a rupture. It is time made audible. That is why the room didn't know what to do. By the late 1980s, Johnny Carson's Tonight Show was not merely a program. It was an institution that had outlived presidents, wars, scandals, and fashions. For 3 decades, Carson had established the modern late-night template: monologue, desk, guest chair, stand, the calm rhythm of the familiar, and then refined it until it looked effortless. He had the rare authority to make the nation feel as if it was ending the day together, under the guidance of someone who seemed unshakable. To appear on The Tonight Show was, for comedians and performers, the cleanest form of validation American entertainment could offer. One good segment could change a career's trajectory. One misjudged joke could shorten it. The power was not just the size of the audience, it was the implication behind the invitation, that you had been approved by the quiet gatekeepers of taste and timing who sat behind the cameras and, more importantly, behind that desk. And in the middle of that system, at the exact center of the image, was Carson's desk. The desk was not decoration, it was a boundary line. It separated the performer from the machinery that supported him, and it separated the guest from the power that judged them. Night after night, the desk suggested steadiness, a place where jokes could land and then be filed away, where awkwardness could be managed with a raised eyebrow, where tension could be softened with a glance toward the band. The desk was also the symbol of control, the illusion that the night was under command. That is why when the note arrived and Carson fell silent behind it, the desk no longer looked like furniture. It looked like a shield, one that, for a moment, did not fully work. In ordinary circumstances, de Cordova lived just off camera. It was part of The Tonight Show's invisible etiquette. The producer was close enough to cue Carson, close enough to make decisions in real time, but not so close that viewers were reminded the show was managed. Even de Cordova's occasional on-air exchanges with Carson were usually quick, half-seen, half-heard moments that vanished before the audience could focus on them. So when he walked onto the stage and broke the boundary of the set, it signaled something the audience intuitively understood. This was not entertainment, this was an emergency. And emergencies are precisely what live television was designed to conceal. What the audience expected that night was familiar professionalism. Carson moving through the opening with precision, the desk functioning as it always did, a confident anchor. Late-night audiences did not tune in for vulnerability, they tuned in for order. Even the jokes, even the looseness, even the improvisation were carefully framed as if the world could be reduced to a manageable punchline before midnight. What actually happened was that Carson, America's most reliable talker, stopped speaking. Those 11 seconds mattered because they revealed a hidden truth about The Tonight Show's power. Carson's authority was not loud, it was not coercive, it was built on restraint, timing, and control of the room. And control in television is measured in seconds.
A host can dominate a studio with a look. He can end an audience's laughter by simply waiting. He can shorten a guest's confidence with a well-timed silence. Carson understood silence as a tool, but this time silence was not a tool, it was a symptom. There's no verified public network transcript that explains word for word what was written on the note in that moment. What is documented, however, is the way real crises collided with the show's discipline and how fragile that discipline became when Carson's private life crossed into the broadcast. The later well-documented tragedy of Carson's son Rick, killed in a car accident in June 1991, shows how The Tonight Show could be forced to carry grief in real time, and how producers even then worried about time and wrapping it up. When Rick Carson died, major news organizations reported the details. The accident occurred on June 21, 1991, and Carson later delivered an on-air tribute, one of the rare moments when the host allowed the audience to see a private wound. That later episode is a matter of record. It illustrates The Tonight Show's central contradiction. The program was built to make everything look controlled, yet it could not fully protect the man at the center when life broke through. That contradiction is the real subject of the 11 seconds. Because Carson's power, his cultural power, was based on the promise that he could absorb anything without showing strain. The audience trusted him because he rarely asked them to hold emotional weight. He offered relief, not confession. He built intimacy without demanding reciprocity. He was present in the nation's homes, yet carefully unreachable in his own life, so private that even those who admired him often described him as socially uncomfortable off-camera. That privacy was not incidental, it was part of the contract. A late-night host who becomes too knowable stops being a ritual and becomes a person, and people are harder to trust than rituals.
The Tonight Show's set design understood this. The desk, the guest couch, the bandstand, each element defined a hierarchy. The guest could come close, but never too close. The band could react, but never interrupt. The audience could laugh, but not control the pace. At the center was Carson, and his desk was the boundary that made him both approachable and protected. When the note arrived, that boundary failed in the most subtle way possible. The audience did not gasp. There was no chaos. What happened instead was uncertainty, an uncertainty that does not read well on television but is unmistakable in a room. People looked for cues. They waited for the applause sign to tell them how to behave. They watched Carson's face for permission to react. They listened for the band to rescue the moment with a flourish. Nothing came. The silence demanded a question The Tonight Show was not designed to answer. What happens when the host needs the audience more than the audience needs the host? In the decades before social media, live television was one of the last places where Americans still experienced time together. Millions saw the same smile at the same second. Millions heard the same punchline, the same saxophone fill, the same "Here's Johnny," and they laughed within the same narrow window. That shared time created cultural power. It created reputations quickly. It created trust. And it created risk. For everyone else on the stage, risk was part of the bargain, especially for comedians. Carson's audience could be generous, but it could also go quiet. And when the room went quiet, the silence belonged to Carson. He could end it whenever he wanted. That is why the 11 seconds mattered. They were not his. They belonged to the note. The note itself, small, folded, carried by the producer, became the night's real authority. On The Tonight Show, objects often carried symbolic weight. A Karnak envelope, a stack of monologue cards, a cue from the band. The show was built on props that looked simple and carried precision. Even Carson's monologue cards, real artifacts that still exist in collections, represent how carefully the spontaneous was prepared. The note was the opposite. It was not designed for television. It was designed for one man. And once it reached him, the desk could not protect him from reading it. That is the deeper shift. A program that usually turned private life into safe public anecdote was suddenly forced to acknowledge a private reality that did not want to be narrated.
Carson's authority had always been invisible because he rarely used it openly. Guests feared being cut short, feared being misread, feared the quiet blacklist that could follow a bad moment. The power was there, but it was not announced. The irony is that silence was one of the ways Carson maintained that power. He could let a joke die and make the comedian feel it. He could pause, look to the audience, and pull them back to him. He could let discomfort hang until it became funny again. Controlled tension as entertainment. But in this moment, the silence did not entertain. It exposed the boundary where entertainment ends.
In those 11 seconds, the crowd's confusion was not just about etiquette, it was about trust. The audience had entrusted the hour to Carson, and suddenly Carson appeared to be receiving a message from a world outside the show's control. The audience did what audiences often do when they sense something real has happened. They became quiet, not out of respect, but out of caution. They did not want to react incorrectly. They did not want to intrude. And The Tonight Show was, at its core, a system that trained people not to intrude. Carson's public image was built on ease, an ease that masked enormous discipline. It is easy to forget now how technical his job was. The Tonight Show was produced on a schedule with breaks, cues, and time constraints. Even in the years when episodes were taped earlier, the structure remained that of live performance, no room for wandering. That discipline is part of why the desk mattered. It was a working surface, not simply a visual icon. It held the pages, the pen, the alignment of the night. Behind it, Carson could appear casual while doing something closer to piloting. For the audience, the desk represented reliability. For Carson, it represented a job. The note threatened to turn the job into something smaller than life. In historical hindsight, we can see how rare it was for The Tonight Show to allow genuine interruption. The show had dealt with famous disruptions, moments of unexpected failure, like psychic Uri Geller's inability to perform under controlled conditions arranged by the staff, which became a landmark moment in late-night television precisely because it exposed the mechanics behind performance. But those moments were still, in a sense, safely inside the frame of entertainment. Even debunking could be broadcast as content. A family emergency cannot. And when it arrived as a note on the desk, the set's entire symbolism flipped. The desk stopped representing control and began representing the illusion of control, a place where the world is supposed to stay manageable. The transformation that followed, whether Carson continued, whether the show adjusted, whether the audience recovered, matters less than the irreversible fact that millions saw the mask slip without drama. Not with tears, not with a speech, with silence. That silence altered perception because it reminded the public that the most powerful figure in late-night television was still a man receiving information he did not choose. It suggested that even The Tonight Show, so often treated as a cultural court, could be penetrated by the ordinary brutality of real life. It also reinforced Carson's invisible authority in a paradoxical way. The silence proved that the set belonged to him so completely that even a breakdown in rhythm became meaningful. In another host's hands, dead air would look like incompetence. With Carson, dead air looked like gravity. That is a particular kind of cultural power, the ability to do nothing and still hold the room. And yet, the same moment hinted at something else, the cost of being trusted by America. A host can become a national habit only by being consistent. Consistency requires control. Control requires distance. Distance can protect a performer from the audience, but it cannot protect him from his own life. This is the quiet philosophical layer beneath the 11 seconds, performance versus authenticity. Carson's genius was not that he was always authentic, it was that he made performance feel trustworthy. He made the nation believe that a well-managed surface could be enough, that if someone smart and calm held the desk, the day could end safely. The note at the desk reminded everyone that safety was always, at best, borrowed. There is a reason historians of television return to the show's physical symbols, the desk, the cue cards, the envelopes, not because they are nostalgic props, but because they reveal how American television manufactured reassurance. A monologue card is proof that spontaneity is often rehearsed. A sealed envelope is proof that mystery can be staged. A desk is proof that authority can be built from furniture and lighting and timing. And when the system fails, it fails in the smallest measurable unit: seconds. 11 of them. Years later, when people spoke about Carson's off-camera nature, his discomfort with casual social contact, his guarded privacy, they often described a man who could be warm on television and distant in life, not because he was cruel, but because he needed the boundary. The Tonight Show's desk was that boundary made visible. On that night in 1987, it became visible in a different way. It became the place where the boundary failed, where control had to share space with contingency, where a nation briefly watched its most practiced performer confront something that could not be performed away. In the end, the moment endures not because Carson went silent, but because the audience did too, because the shared national experience briefly stopped being entertainment and became observation. People watched, not as fans, but as witnesses, trying to understand what was happening without being told. That is what live television once did better than anything else. It made millions of strangers into one room, listening to the same silence. And perhaps that is the quiet truth behind Johnny Carson's reign. America trusted him because he made public life feel orderly. He made the nation's noise seem containable. He made the complicated appear smooth. But every so often, time broke through the format. A note reached the desk. The red light stayed on. The applause sign offered no instruction. And for 11 seconds, the illusion of ease, built with such precision, revealed the human cost of holding it.